Welcome back to One Boring Historian. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Are you in New York at midnight with the lights off? Or in London with your morning coffee? Drop your location and time in the comments. It is always fun seeing this little community scattered across the world. Now, picture this. 150 men, women, and children set out to build a new life in America, and then vanished without a trace. No bodies, no graves, just one strange word carved into a tree. Would you have survived Roanoke, or disappeared with the rest, if you enjoy these long, con journeys into history's strangest corners? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe. It helps more curious minds stumble across this channel. Now let's begin. To understand a vanishing, one must first understand the presence. To comprehend an absence, we must first populate the stage with all the sound and fury that preceded the silence. The story of the lost colony of Roanoke does not begin on a windswept American shore, scoured clean of human trace. It begins here, in the latter half of the 16th century, in the damp, smoky, and fervently beating heart of Elizabethan England. It begins not with a mystery, but with an ambition so vast it sought to conquer entire oceans. Imagine, if you will, the light. Not the clear and troubled light of a summer's day, but the particular, filtered luminescence of a world lit by flame and tallow. In the great halls of power, like the palace of surmise, light struggled valiantly against encroaching shadow, glinting off the polished oak of long tables, catching the threads of gold in a courtier's doublet, and painting the faces of queen and councillor in a flickering, dramatic chiaroscuro. The air in these rooms was thick with the scent of wood smoke from great fireplaces, of beeswax from the candles, and the underlying, not unpleasant aroma of humanity, of perfumes designed to mask less savory odors, of the wool from tapestries that lined the cold stone walls, and of the slow, vegetal decay of the rushes strewn upon the floor. This was a world of textures, of proximity, of whispers that carried as much weight as proclamations. And at the center of it all, a figure as still and calculating as the spider at the center of its web, Queen Elizabeth, Gloriana herself. Her England was a nation perched on a precipice. It was a realm both burgeoning with a newfound confidence and riddled with profound, existential anxieties. The old certainties of the Catholic faith had been violently stripped away, replaced by the austere, wood-centric theology of the Protestant Reformation. This was not a clean break, but a messy, generational schism that left its scars on the national psyche. Every sermon from the pulpit of St. Paul's Cross was not just a lesson in piety, but a political statement, a reinforcement of the Queen's supreme authority over both church and state. And this religious defiance had a geopolitical consequence: the colossal, brooding presence of Habsburg Spain. Under King Philip II, Spain was not merely a rival. It was the avenging arm of the papacy, a global empire upon which the sun truly never set, its galleons trailing across the oceans in endless, wealth-laden caravans. England was the upstart, the heretic nation, a minnow swimming in waters dominated by a leviathan. Every English sea captain who ventured into the Atlantic knew he sailed under the suspicious gaze of Spanish power, a power that considered those waters and the lands beyond its divine and exclusive preserve. Yet, it was precisely this sense of encirclement and religious fervor that forged a new kind of English ambition. It was an ambition born of a desperate need for wealth, for strategic advantage, and for a place in the sun literally and figuratively. The court was filled with men known as the West Country men, a network of gentlemen, sea captains, and financiers from the southwestern counties, whose gazes were perpetually turned westward, towards the vast and known expanse of the Oceanus Atlanticus. They were readers of Hacklight, collectors of charts and travellers' tales, men who dreamed of finding the Northwest Passage, a mythical sea route to the fabled riches of Cathay, and the Spice Islands that would bypass the Spanish and Portuguese monopolies. They were also, crucially, men who saw colonies not just as trading posts, but as extensions of England itself, as Protestant refuges and as bastions from which to harry the Spanish treasure fleets. This was not mere exploration, it was a form of national and religious warfare by other means. To comprehend the sheer scale of their audacity, one must step away from the rarefied air of the court and into the chaotic, vibrant, and overwhelmingly pungent world of the London docks. Let us take a metaphorical journey down the Thames, say, to the area of Ratcliffe Wapping. The first thing that would strike you is the sounder cacophony of creaking timber, shouted orders in a dozen different accents, the rhythmic clatter of capstans, the cries of gulls wheeling overhead, and the low, constant groan of rope and woodless ships, like great slumbering beasts, shifted at their moorings. The air was a complex tapestry of smells, the sharp, clean scent of salt and the tidal mud, the profound resinous odor of tar and pitch being heated in great cauldrons to caulk the seams of vessels, the earthy, fungal smell of the ballast sand and stone from distant shores piled upon the wharves. There was the scent of spices, faint and alluring, wafting from the warehouses of the Muscovy Company, and the overwhelming, eye-watering stench of the tanneries and the slaughterhouses. A reminder that the city's more mundane industries carried on, indifferent to the dreams of empire, and the ships themselves. To our modern eyes, they would appear terrifyingly small, almost laughably fragile for the tasks assigned to them. A vessel like the bark Raleigh, which would play a part in our story, might displace only 100 tons. Its deck would be cramped, its hold a dark, damp, and airless space. Its ribs, hewn from great English oaks, were the skeleton upon which the hopes of a nation were being built. Looking at these ships, one is struck by the sheer physical courage, or perhaps the blissful ignorance, of the men who sailed them. They were venturing into a void, into the green sea of darkness, as the old cartographers labelled it, in what were essentially oversized fishing boats. They would be crammed together for weeks, their diet consisting of salted beef so hard it could be carved into buttons, weevil-ridden biscuit, and beer that soured as the voyage progressed. Their navigation was a mixture of nascent science and profound art, relying on the cross-staff and the astrolabe to measure the angle of the sun and stars, on trailing logs to estimate speed, and on the intuition of men who could read the color of the water and the flight of birds. These sailors, these mariners, were a breed apart. Their faces were leathered by sun and salt spray, their hands callous from hulling on endless lines. Many bore the scars of past voyages, a missing finger, a puckered wound from a Spanish musket ball, the limp from a fall from the rigging in a gale off Finisterre. They were superstitious, devout in their own rough way, and their world was populated by omens and signs. A sudden squall could be a punishment from God, the sighting of a dolphin, the promise of fair weather. They swapped tales of mermaids and sea monsters, of islands of gold and fountains of youth. They were the physical instrument of England's ambition, the sinew and muscle that would propel these tiny wooden shells across 2,000 miles of open ocean, and they were drawn by the twin laws that have always motivated such men, the faint, glittering hope of wealth, and the powerful, intoxicating drug of discovery. Back in the candlelit chambers of London, the men who funded these voyages saw things in a different light, for men like Sir Walter Raleigh, the handsome, flamboyant, and brilliantly ambitious courtier who held the Queen's favour and her patent for exploration. These ships were chess pieces on a global board. Raleigh himself was the very embodiment of the Elizabethan age, a poet, a soldier, a courtier, and a ruthless promoter of his own interests. He understood that glory and power were the currencies of the court, and that a successful colony in the New World would bear his name, cement his legacy, and fill his coffers. He spent a fortune, a veritable king's ransom, equipping these expeditions. The provisioning lists were meticulous, a testament to both the ambition and the profound ignorance of what lay ahead. They packed woolen cloth, assuming trade with sophisticated empires like those of the Aztecs or Incas. Not realizing the indigenous peoples of the coast they would target lived in a different climatic and cultural world. They brought suits of armor, perfectly useless in the dense, humid woodlands of the American Southeast. They included Bibles and communion sets, intent on saving souls, and glass beads and copper kettles, with which to barter for them. This push for colonization was, therefore, a strange and often contradictory alloy. It was part crusade, part commercial enterprise, and part strategic gambit. The preachers thundered from their pulpits about the divine duty to spread the gospel to the savages languishing in heathen darkness. The merchants calculated the potential profits from sassafras, a plant believed to cure the French, pox, syphilis, or from the harvesting of naval stores like timber and pitch. The privy councillors, men like the shrewd and cautious Lord Burghley, looked at maps and saw potential bases from which the dreaded Spanish floater could be intercepted, its river of silver dammed at its source. All these threads, the religious, the economic, the geopolitical, were woven together into the single, stout hemp cable that would tether an English colony to the shores of the New World. The mood, then, was one of febrile expectation, a national holding of breath. Every returning ship that worked its way up the Thames was a potential bearer of momentous news. Crowds would gather. Merchants would pause their calculations, and courtiers would dispatch servants to the docks for the latest intelligence. Had they found the passage? Had they located a city of gold? Had they clashed with the Spanish? The air was thick with rumors, with exaggerated reports, with the grandiose claims of promoters seeking further investment. It was into this atmosphere, this crucible of hope, fear, and avarice, that the first concrete reports from the coast of Virginia, a land named for the Virgin Queen, began to filter back. The initial reconnaissance voyages, led by men like Philip Amotes and Arthur Barlow, returned with rapturous accounts. They spoke of a land of immense fertility, of forests so tall they seemed to scrape the sky, of grapevines growing wild and in profusion, of a climate so mild and agreeable it was like a perpetual spring. They brought back to native men, Manteo and Wanchese, who walked the streets of London as living curiosities, their presence both proving the existence of this new world and fueling the wildest of speculations about its nature and its peoples. The stage, as I said, was now set. The players were in place, the calculating queen, the ambitious courtiers, the hardened mariners, the expectant merchants. The script was a mixture of gospel, gold, and glory. The destination was a place on the map called Roanoke Island. All that remained was for the curtain to rise on this great and tragic drama. The ships were being readied, their holds filled with the hopes of a nation. They would sail on the tide, their sails catching the wind, carrying with them not just men and supplies, but a whole worldview, a set of assumptions and ambitions that would soon be tested against the unyielding and ultimately inscrutable reality of the New World. The ambition, having been forged in the firelit chambers of London, now had to be translated into the brutal, physical reality of an ocean crossing. Sir Walter Raleigh, the brilliant and charismatic courtier who held the Queen's patent for discovery, was not a man to let grass grow under his feet, while he himself would never set foot in the New World. His value, and his power were rooted in his proximity to the Queen. He was a master of promotion and organization. His role was that of an impresario, a visionary who could spin dreams of gold and glory into the hard currency of royal favor and investment. He assembled the ships, the men, and the materiel, but more importantly, he provided the irresistible narrative of a new English Eden across the sea, a Virginia that would be both a bulwark against Spain and a testament to the glory of Elizabeth. The first voyages, therefore, were not blind leaps into the dark, but carefully calculated reconnaissances. In 1584, Raleigh dispatched to Berks, under the command of Philip Amadis and Arthur Barlow, on a scouting mission. Their instructions were not to plant a colony, but to map the coast, assess the resources, and, most critically, to establish friendly relations with the native peoples. They were to find a suitable location, a place that was defensible, with a deep-water harbor and surrounded by fertile land and friendly tribes. They were, in essence, the advance scouts for a dream, to understand the significance of their journey. We must first step aboard their vessel, perhaps the bark Raleigh, as it departs the familiar confines of Plymouth Sound. The sense of occasion, the fluttering of pennants, and the well-wishes from the shore would have been quickly replaced by the profound, isolating reality of the open ocean. The ship itself was a world unto itself, a tiny, wooden island adrift in a universe of water and sky. The sounds were constant and particular, the hypnotic creak and groan of the hull as it worked against the sea, the snap and rustle of the sails as they caught the wind, the endless slosh and gurgle of water along the keel. The ship was alive with its own unique language of sound and motion, a constant, rolling pitch and yaw that became the new normal for every soul on board. Life aboard this floating world was a study in enforced intimacy and rigid hierarchy. The captain and the gentleman, like Barlow himself, might have a small, cramped cabin in the stern, a dark space barely large enough for a cot and a sea chest. The common sailors, the mariners, had no such luxury. They slept where they could, in hammocks slung in the low-beamed forecastle, or simply on the deck, curled up amongst the coils of rope and the casks of salt beef. Their world was one of damp wool and unwashed bodies, the air thick with the smell of bilge waterfowl, stagnant cocktail of sea odor, rot, and human waste that sloshed in the very bowels of the ship. Their diet was a monotonous assault on the senses, hardtack. A biscuit so durable it had to be tapped sharply on the table to dislodge the weevils living within. Salt pork or beef, so hard and fibrous it was like chewing on leather. And beer, a weak, soured brew that was nonetheless safer to drink than the stagnant water, which was stored in wooden casks and quickly developed a foul, alcohol tang. The journey itself was a test of endurance, a weeks-long passage through a landscape devoid of landmarks. Navigation was an act of faith and skill. The pilot would take sightings with his cross staff, a clumsy wooden instrument used to measure the angle of the sun at its zenith, squinting against the glare of the water. He would consult his charts, which were often works of fantasy, adorned with sea monsters and illustrations of mythical kings. He would cast the log, a weighted piece of wood tied to a knotted rope, counting the knots that ran through his hands in a measured half-minute to estimate the ship's speed. For weeks, they saw nothing but the endless, heaving grey-green of the Atlantic, the soaring arc of the sky, and the occasional companionable port of dolphins racing playfully in the bow wave. Storms were a special kind of terror, the descent into a roaring chaos where the world was reduced to the violent crash of waves against the hull, the shrieking of the wind in the rigging, and the desperate prayers of men convinced that God's judgment was upon them. Then, after this long and wearying passage, came the moment of discovery. It would not have been a sudden sighting of a distinct shoreline, but a gradual accumulation of signs. The color of the water would change, from the deep indigo of the open ocean to a lighter, murkier green. The taste of the air would shift, carrying the faint, earthy scent of land of pine and loam and blooming things. Pieces of driftwood and strange, floating vegetation would be spotted, and then the cry from the crow's nest, a high, excited shout that would electrify the entire ship. Land ho! The land that revealed itself to Amodus and Barlow in July of 1584 was the Outer Banks of present-day North Carolina. This was not a mainland, but a fragile, shifting chain of barrier islands, slender ribbons of sand and scrub separated from the continent by a vast, shallow sound. To the English eyes, accustomed to the chalk cliffs of Dover or the rugged coasts of Cornwall, it was a strange and beautiful sight. They described the scent of the land long before they set foot on it, a powerful, sweet perfume of flowers and cedar that was carried miles out to sea on the westerly wind. As they navigated through the inlets, a treacherous business of shifting shoals and hidden sandbars, they entered the calm, brackish waters of the Sounds. Here, the water was a placid, greenish mirror, reflecting the vast, cloud-dappled sky. The air was thick, humid, and heavy with the drone of insects, a sound entirely foreign to English ears. Their first sustained contact was with the CROATOAN people, an Algonquian-speaking tribe whose territory encompassed Roanoke Island and the surrounding mainland. The initial encounters were a masterpiece of mutual curiosity and profound miscomprehension. From the English deck, the native people who approached in their dugout canoes, fashioned from single, massive logs, were figures of both fascination and apprehension. They were tall, well-proportioned, and, to English eyes, remarkably unself-conscious in their near nudity, their skin decorated with intricate tattoos and painted with dark, earthy colors. They possessed an apparent physical vitality that seemed to speak of the land's health. The English, in their heavy woolen clothes, their faces pale from weeks at sea, their bodies encased in stiff, unnatural fabrics, must have seemed equally strange, perhaps even ghost-like, to the CROATOAN, Arthur Barlow's subsequent report, which was doubtless polished and amplified for Raleigh's and the Queen's consumption, painted a picture of a terrestrial paradise. He described the soil as the most plentiful, sweet, fruitful and wholesome of all the world. He wrote of forests of towering cedars and cypresses, their trunks so vast that 3 men could not link arms round them. He described grapevines growing in such profusion that they overwhelmed the trees, and wild grapes so plentiful that the very surge of the sea sounded like waves breaking against a beach covered in the He told of the native people as being most gentle, loving and faithful, void of all guile and treason, who lived in a state of primitive communism, sharing everything they had. It was a vision of the noble savage, an idealized portrait that served a specific purpose, to promote the colony and attract investors and settlers. The reality, as it always is, was more complex, more nuanced, and far more interesting. The CROATOAN were not simple children of nature living in a timeless utopia. They were a sophisticated people with a deep understanding of their environment. Their world was governed by complex spiritual beliefs and a social hierarchy led by a werowance, or chief. Their villages, like the one of CROATOAN itself, which Barlow visited, were composed of long houses made of sapling frames covered with bark or woven mats. These were not temporary camps, but permanent settlements, surrounded by carefully managed agricultural fields. They grew maize, or Guinea wheat as the English called it, in orderly mounds, along with beans, squash and sunflowers. They managed the forests through controlled burning to create park-like landscapes that were ideal for hunting deer and other game. Their calendar was a cycle of planting, harvesting, and hunting. punctuated by religious ceremonies and periods of feasting and fasting. The English, for all their technological advantages in the form of metals, guns, and sailing ships, were the ones who were naive. They saw the CROATOAN's willingness to share food initially as a sign of their inherent generosity and lack of commercial avarice. They failed to understand the complex rules of reciprocity and obligation that govern such exchanges in CROATOAN society. A gift was not merely a gift, it created a debt, a bond that demanded a future return. When the English offered glass beads, copper kettles, and iron knives in trade for provisions, they thought they were engaging in simple commerce. The CROATOAN likely saw it as the establishment of an alliance, a relationship of mutual obligation between powerful, if strange, newcomers and themselves. This fundamental misalignment of cultural understanding was a crack in the foundation of their relationship, a tiny, almost invisible fissure that would, in time, widen into a chasm. But in those first, harried days of discovery, with the scent of cedar on the air and the promise of a new Eden seeming to be fulfilled, such concerns were for the future. The scouts had found their promised land. The stage was set for the next, more permanent act. The reports brought back by Modders and Barlow were not merely successful, they were incendiary. They painted a picture so idyllic, so overflowing with natural bounty and gentle natives, that the fever for colonization in England reached a new pitch. Sir Walter Raleigh, ever the master of spectacle, was knighted by the Queen, and the new land was named Virginia in her honor. The reconnaissance was over, the time for settlement had come. And so, in April of 1585, a much larger expedition set sail from Plymouth under the command of a man whose temperament was as far from the paradisiacal vision of Virginia as one could imagine, Sir Rich. Grenville. Grenville was a West Country gentleman, a soldier, and a man of formidable pride and a famously short temper. He was courage personified, with a reputation for audacity forged in the religious wars of Hungary and on the high seas against the Spanish. But he was not a diplomat. His concept of command was rooted in the unyielding hierarchies of the battlefield and the aristocratic code of honor. He was the wrong man to send to a fragile new world where survival would depend on nuance, patience, and the careful cultivation of complex relationships. Accompanying him, though on separate vessels, was the man who would become the colony's governor, a soldier and seasoned administrator named Ralph Lane. Lane was a different sort, pragmatic, disciplined, and possessed of a soldier's eye for train and fortification. He was the spine of the enterprise, while Grenville was its sword. The fleet itself was a statement of intent. 7 ships, including Grenville's own formidable flagship, the Tiger. They carried not just sailors and soldiers, but also a carefully selected group of planters, men intended to become permanent settlers, as well as a scientist, Thomas Harriot, and an artist, John White. The inclusion of Harriot and White was a stroke of genius, a sign that this was to be more than a mere military outpost or a privateering base. It was to be a permanent extension of England, a place where the natural philosophy and the artistic sensibilities of the Renaissance would take root in new soil. The holds of the ships were stuffed with the ambitious, incongruous cargo of a civilization attempting to transplant itself, crates of glass beads and iron tools for trade, but also Bibles, communion sets, printing type, suits of armor, and the seeds of European vegetables. They carried their world with them, in miniature, a cargo of assumptions packed in oak and canvas. The journey was, as these voyages often were, a trial by water. The Tiger, running ahead of the fleet, was separated and ran aground on a shoal, a terrifying moment where the great ship shuddered and groaned, its hull grinding against the hidden sand. It was refloated, but not before a significant portion of its precious cargo, the food supplies, the seed grain, the salt, was ruined by seawater. It was an illumine, a first, concrete taste of how this new world could casually destroy the best-laid plans of the old. When they finally reassembled and navigated the treacherous inlets to reach Roanoke Island in the summer of 1585, the sense of relief was palpable, but it was already tinged with anxiety. The lost supplies meant their margin for error. Their buffer against the unknown had been dramatically reduced from the very start. The site chosen for the settlement was a practical one. Roanoke Island was a sliver of land, about 12 miles long and 3 miles wide, nestled between the Outer Banks and the mainland. It was defensible, surrounded by water, and according to their scouts, it was inhabited by a people who had been friendly. Under Ralph Lane's disciplined direction, the work of building the city of Raleigh began. It was not a city, nor even a village in any English sense of the word. It was, first and foremost, a fortress. Imagine the scene, the relentless Carolina sun, so different from the gentle warmth of an English summer, beating down on a clearing hacked from the pine and cedar woods. The air, thick with humidity, would have been filled with the sounds of English labor, the rhythmic thunk of axes biting into the resinous wood of massive trees, the rasp of two-handed saws, the shouted orders of the foreman. The scent was of fresh-cut timber, of disturbed earth, and of the sweat of men performing back-breaking work in unfamiliar, heavy clothing. They built a fort, an earthenwork bastion reinforced with timber, its design a product of Lane's military experience in Ireland. Within its protective perimeter, they began to erect a scatter of crude, timber-frame structures with thatched roofs, a storehouse, a chapel, a barracks, and perhaps a few rudimentary dwellings for the gentlemen and the leadership. It was a functional, grim little outpost, a stark contrast to the lush and tamed beauty that surrounded it. There were no cozy cottages with gardens, no inns, no smithies on a high street. This was a beachhead, not a community. The presence of Thomas Harriot and John White during these early months provides us with a window into the intellectual wonder that coexisted with the harsh struggle for survival. While soldiers stood guard and laborers strained, Harriot, a brilliant mathematician and astronomer, was meticulously observing and recording everything. He learned the Algonquian language from two natives, Manteo and Wanchese, who had been brought to England and now returned as translators and intermediaries. With their help, Harriot began to systematically document the natural world and the culture of the CROATOAN. He took notes on the cultivation of maize, a crop unknown in Europe, describing its three sisters corn, beans, and squash growing together in a symbiotic relationship. He studied the local plants, noting which had medicinal properties and which were poisonous. He observed the CROATOAN's spiritual beliefs, their complex social structures, and their political rivalries alongside him. John White was creating a visual record of breathtaking detail and accuracy. His watercolor paintings are not romanticized fantasies. They are ethnographic documents. He painted the CROATOAN people not as generic savages, but as individuals with distinct features and expressions. He painted their villages, showing the long houses, the ceremonial circles, the drying racks filled with fish. He painted the local wildlife, the now extinct Carolina parakeet in a fillet of green and yellow, the lumbering, magnificent bear, the shark-toothed alligator. In these paintings, we see a world being seen clearly, perhaps for the first and last time. By European eyes, it was a world of order, complexity, and profound beauty. But the perspective of Harriot and White was not the perspective that would govern the colony. The relationship with the CROATOAN, initially cordial, began to fray almost immediately. The English, from the moment of their arrival, were a drain on local resources. There were over 100 of them, and they had arrived late in the season to plant their own crops. Their ruined supplies meant they were immediately and profoundly dependent on the CROATOAN for food. What had begun as a trade relationship, with the English offering trinkets for corn, quickly became a demand. In the English view, they were paying for the food. In the CROATOAN view, led by their warehouse Wingina, the continuous requests for vast quantities of their stored maize, the very substance of their survival through the winter, was becoming an unsustainable extraction. The English, with their insatiable appetite, were like a blight upon the land. Misunderstandings piled upon one another. A silver cup went missing from the English camp. Convinced it had been stolen, Grenville, in a display of the very arrogance that made him ill-suited for this task, responded not with diplomacy, but with overwhelming force. He ordered the burning of an entire CROATOAN village and the destruction of their cornfields. It was a catastrophic overreaction, act of terror designed to showcase English power. But it did not create fear. It created a deep and abiding hatred. It taught the CROATOAN that these newcomers were not allies, but capricious and violent gods, their whims as destructive as a hurricane. Ralph Lane, a more calculating man than Grenville, understood the precariousness of their position, but his response was not to seek reconciliation. It was to double down on military posture. He launched exploratory missions into the interior, seeking the rumored wealthy kingdom of the Mongoks to the north, hoping to find gold or a passage to the Pacific. He saw the land through a soldier's lens, mapping it for its defensive potential and its resources. He maintained a relationship with Mantio's people, the CROATOANs from the nearby island of CROATOAN, who remained friendly. But his primary alliance with Wingina's CROATOAN had been poisoned by Grenville's raid, as the winter of 1585–86 set in. The situation grew increasingly desperate. The English were hungry. Their own supplies were gone, and the CROATOAN, now openly hostile, were refusing to trade. The promised supply ship from England did not arrive. The paradise described by Barlow had become a gilded cage. A beautiful but deadly prison. Men grew weak from hunger and disease, dysentery, perhaps, or typhoid sicknesses born of poor sanitation and malnutrition. The daily life in the fort became a grim routine of guard duty, foraging for anything edible, and watching the dark, silent line of the forest from which an attack could come at any moment. The sounds of construction were replaced by the sounds of sickness and the muttered prayers of desperate men. The grand project of the city of Raleigh had been reduced to a single, stark objective: survival. John White's paintings from this time, had he made any, would have shown a very different scene. Not the vibrant life of the CROATOAN, but the hollow-eyed faces of his countrymen, their fine woolen clothes now tattered, their bodies gaunt, moving through a fortress that felt less like a protection and more like a tomb. The intellectual curiosity of the first days had been starved out of them, replaced by a primal focus on the next meal. They were strangers in a strange land, and the land, and its original inhabitants, were turning against them. The fortress was built. The English flag flew over Roanoke Island. But the dream of a new English Eden was dying, not with a bang, but with the slow, relentless gnawing of hunger on this island, gathering fury of those they had wronged. The winter of 1585–86 on Roanoke Island was not a season of crisp frost and cheerful hearts, as it might have been in England. It was a season of damp, penetrating cold that seeped into the timber of the fort and into the very bones of the men. It was a time of lengthening shadows, not just from the low-hanging sun, but from the spectre of famine and the palpable, growing enmity of the CROATOAN people. The initial, fragile cord of mutual curiosity had been severed, first by Sir Richard Grenville's punitive raid, and now by the relentless, grinding pressure of the English presence. The colony was no longer a novel outpost of exploration. It had become a starving garrison, besieged not by armies arrayed in formal lines, but by a silent, watchful forest and the unforgiving arithmetic of a dwindling food supply. Within the fort, the atmosphere was one of taut anxiety. Governor Ralph Lane, a man of action and discipline, found his leadership tested in ways for which no European warfare had prepared him. His command structure, built on the clear hierarchies of a military company, began to fray under the corrosive effects of hunger and fear. The gentleman, who had envisioned a life of landed ease in a new world, chafed at the relentless manual labor and the meager rations. The soldiers and laborers, their bellies cramped with emptiness, grumbled and cast suspicious eyes on their officers, wondering if they were hoarding supplies. Lane's journal, had he kept one in this period, would have been a chronicle of desperation. Each day was a calculation of consumption versus depletion. How many handfuls of moly grain remained in the casks? How many men were too weak from the bloody flux, dysentery to stand watch? How many more days could they eke out an existence on boiled acorns, tough shellfish gathered from the shore, and the occasional stringy rabbit snared in the woods? The relationship with the CROATOAN had deteriorated into a tense, armed standoff. The friendly visits and exchanges of goods were a memory. Now, when CROATOAN canoes were seen on the water, they kept their distance. When English foraging parties ventured beyond the palisade, they moved in armed groups, their matchlocks primed, their eyes scanning the dense undergrowth for any sign of an ambush. The CROATOAN, under the leadership of Wingina, who had now taken the powerful name Pemisopen, meaning one who watches, had come to a grim conclusion. These English were not temporary visitors. They were blight, a sickness that consumed everything in its path and gave nothing of value in return. Their presence had disrupted the delicate balance of trade and alliance among the coastal tribes. Their demands for food threatened the CROATOAN's very survival. Pemisopen understood that the English could not be driven out by direct assault. Their firearms and fortifications were too powerful. But they could be starved, isolated, and worn down into leaving. Pemisopen therefore began a campaign of subtle, psychological warfare, a strategy of misinformation and isolation. He spread word among the neighboring tribes that the English were a hostile, predatory force, intent on conquest. He instructed his own people to feign a shortage of food, to hide their corn stores, and to provide false information to the English. When Ralph Lane, desperate for a solution, planned an expedition up the Roanoke River to seek out the powerful Roanoke tribe rumored to have great stores of grain, Pemisopen's men subtly discouraged him, suggesting the Roanoke were hostile and the river too dangerous. It was a masterful manipulation, using the English reliance on native intelligence against them, constricting their world until the fort on Roanoke Island felt like the only solid ground in a sea of hostile intent. The breaking point came in the early spring of 1586, a pivotal moment, born of mutual paranoia, pushed the simmering conflict into open violence. A loyal CROATOAN informant, or perhaps one of Lane's own scouts, brought word to the fort that Pemisopen was orchestrating a unified attack. The plan, as reported, was for several surrounding tribes to assemble and launch a coordinated assault on the English settlement. The details were likely a mixture of fact, exaggeration, and the frantic rumors of a terrified colony. But for Lane, it was the final, undeniable proof of CROATOAN treachery. He saw not a people defending their homeland from a parasitic invasion, but a conspiracy of savages breaking their word. In the stark, binary morality of an Elizabethan soldier, This demanded a preemptive and overwhelming response. Lane decided on a desperate gambit, a decapitation strike. He would not wait to be attacked within his walls. He would take the fight to the CROATOAN leadership and shatter their alliance before it could form. The plan was audacious and ruthless. Feigning a peaceful parley, Lane and a hand-picked group of his best-armed men approached the CROATOAN village on the mainland where Pemisopen was residing. The details of what followed are murky, filtered through the self-justifying lens of Lane's subsequent report. But the outcome was stark and brutal in the confused and likely deliberately provoked skirmish that erupted. Pemisopen was killed, shot down as he fled. The English, having achieved their primary objective, fought a fighting retreat back to their boats, leaving behind a village in chaos and a people now united not by strategy, but by grief and a burning desire for vengeance. Militarily, Lane's raid was a success. He had eliminated his most capable adversary and temporarily disrupted CROATOAN coordination. But politically and strategically, it was a catastrophe. It transformed a war of attrition into a blood feud. There could now be no reconciliation, no return to trade, no hope of peaceful coexistence. The English had burned their last bridge. They were utterly alone on an increasingly hostile shore, with their food all but gone and no sign of the promised relief fleet from England. The victory felt hollow, a brief, violent spasm that had only deepened their predicament. The mood in the fort after the raid was not one of triumph, but of exhausted dread. They had won a battle, but they were losing the struggle for survival. And then, as if in answer to a prayer they had long since ceased to utter, a miracle appeared on the horizon. But it was not the miracle they had expected. In early June of 1586, a vast fleet of ships, over 20 strong, have into view of the Outer Banks. This was not Sir Richard Grenville returning with supplies. This was the fleet of Sir Francis Drake, the legendary privateer, returning from a massively successful plundering expedition against the Spanish in the Caribbean. Drake's arrival was a world-altering event for the beleaguered colonists. His ships were floating treasure chests, laden with Spanish gold, silver, and other luxuries. His men were hearty, well-fed, and flushed with victory for a few days. The fort on Roanoke Island was a scene of surreal contrast. The emaciated, ragged colonists stood alongside Drake's robust sailors, men who spoke of sacking Spanish cities and capturing galleons. Lane saw in Drake's fleet not just a rescue, but a reinforcement. He pleaded with the privateer for supplies, for men, for ships to continue the colonial enterprise. Drake, ever pragmatic and generous, agreed. He offered them one of his smaller ships, the Francis, along with ample supplies and the services of any of his men who wished to stay. It seemed like a divine intervention, a second wind for the dying colony. But the Atlantic, the great, indifferent stage upon which this drama was playing out, had one more card to play. As the Francis was being loaded with the new supplies, a monstrous storm, a great tempest, blew in from the east. These were the hurricanes that the English had no name for and no experience with. For days, the fleet was pummeled by winds of terrifying force and towering waves. When the storm finally abated, the Francis, the colonists' new lifeline, along with many of the crucial supplies, had been driven out to sea, lost, or wrecked on the unforgiving shoals. The storm broke the last of Ralph Lane's resolve. The sequence of events, the constant hunger, the pervasive hostility, the desperate violence of the raid on Pemisopen, the soaring hope of Drake's rival, and the crushing loss of the ship and supplies was too much. The calculus was now simple and brutal. To stay was to die, either by starvation or in a final, overwhelming CROATOAN attack. Drake, seeing the situation for what it was, offered the colonists a way out. He would carry them all back to England. The decision was likely made with a heavy heart, but also with the profound relief of men who have stared into the abyss. There was no ceremony, no solemn lowering of the flag. The abandonment was hurried, pragmatic. In the face of the continuing bad weather and the threat of Spanish ships, for Drake's presence was a beacon to his enemies. The colonists boarded the great ships of the fleet. They took what they could carry, leaving behind the fort, the crude cottages, the rusting pieces of armor, and the heavy, useless tools. They left behind the dream of the city of Raleigh. As Drake's fleet caught the wind and turned its bow towards the open ocean and home, the few men left on the decks would have seen the low, green line of Roanoke Island recede into the distance, the wilderness, which they had tried to dominate and reshape, had won. It had absorbed their ambition, their labor, and their violence, and was already beginning the slow process of erasing their footprint. The colony was not vanished. Not yet, but it was empty. A silence, profound and unsettling, had fallen where the sounds of axes and prayers and desperate men had once been. It was a silence that would, in time, become a mystery. The return of the Lane colony in the summer of 1586 was not the end of the Roanoke venture, for Sir Walter Raleigh, and for the men who had invested their fortunes and reputations. It was merely a setback. The narrative, however, had to change. The first modular military garrison led by soldiers and gentlemen had proven fatally flawed. It had created dependency and conflict. The new vision, conceived in the aftermath of failure, was more ambitious and, in theory, more sustainable. It would not be a fortress, but a true community. It would be a plantation, a planting of English society itself into the American soil. The 1587 expedition was to be a colony of families, men, their wives, and their children. They would not be soldiers awaiting relief, but farmers, craftsmen, and artisans intending to build a permanent, self-sufficient home. They would replicate the rhythms of English village life, and in doing so, they would put down roots so deep that no storm or shortage could dislodge them. To lead this profoundly different enterprise, Raleigh chose a man who was not a soldier, but an artist and a veteran of the previous voyage, John White. White was not a typical governor. He was an observer, a man who had documented the New World with a scientist's eye and an artist's hand. His leadership was intended to be paternal, not martial. His own family was part of the venture. Accompanying him were his daughter, Eleanor, and her husband, Ananias Dare, a bricklayer and tiler. This single detail, the presence of a governor's pregnant daughter, signaled a fundamental shift in intent. This was not a temporary posting. It was a migration. The fleet that departed England in the spring of 1587 was smaller than Grenville's Grand Armada. There were 3 ships, the flagship Lion, and 2 smaller pinnaces. The Passenger Manifest was a microcosm of English rural society, a deliberate attempt to transplant a functioning community. There were, of course, the gentleman men like Ananias Dare, but their status was now tied to their practical skills. More importantly, there were the yeoman farmers, men who knew how to turn the soil and husband livestock. There were craftsmen essential for building a lasting settlement, a cooper, to make the barrels that would store their food and water, a blacksmith to forge nails, tools, and hardware, a mason and a carpenter, and there were their wives. Women whose labor was the bedrock of any pre-industrial society. These women would have been responsible for the endless, vital tasks of processing food, making and mending clothing, tending to small kitchen gardens, raising children, and maintaining the domestic sphere that was the heart of a home. Their presence transformed the venture from an expedition into a society in waiting. The Atlantic crossing for these families would have been a trial of a different nature than for the soldiers of 1585, the cramped conditions, the monotonous and unwholesome food. The terrifying storms, these were all the same. But the psychological landscape was different. For a soldier, the voyage was a prelude to a campaign. For these families, it was a rupture, a final, irrevocable severing from the world they knew. As the cliffs of England faded behind them, they were sailing towards a future that was entirely theoretical, built on the sometimes rosy, sometimes ominous reports of the men who had gone before. The women, in particular, must have felt this profoundly. They were leaving behind their mothers, their sisters, their friends, the familiar patterns of their village life, the certainties of the church calendar, the gossip at the market cross. They were traveling to a land where there were no midwives, no grandmother's wisdom, no comforting presence beyond their own small circle. They were going to build a world from scratch, and the weight of that undertaking, during the long, lonely weeks at sea, must have been immense when land was finally sighted in July of 1587. The relief was tempered by immediate complication. Their intended destination was not Roanoke Island, but the shores of the Chesapeake Bay, an area reported to have deeper harbors, more fertile land, and friendlier native tribes. But the Portuguese pilot of the Lion, Simon Fernandez, a man with a dubious past and a volatile temperament, refused to take them further. He claimed the season was too advanced, that he needed to turn to privateering against the Spanish. His real reasons remain one of the many murky subplots of the story. And so, against Governor White's wishes, the colonists were deposited back onto the stage of the previous failure, Roanoke Island. Their arrival at the old fort site was a somber homecoming. They found the earthenworks and timber palisades of Lane's fort still standing, but being slowly reclaimed by vines and undergrowth. The crude buildings within were empty. Decaying shells. The only signs of the previous inhabitants were a few rusted pieces of metal and perhaps the sun-bleached bones of the one Englishman who had been killed by the CROATOAN in 1585, a grim memento mori. The forest had crept closer. It was a place of ghosts. For John White, who had drawn this place teeming with life, both English and CROATOAN, it must have been a deeply unsettling sight. For the new colonists, it was their first concrete taste of the reality they faced. They were not stepping into a pristine paradise, but into a place of history, a place of past conflict and failure. There was no time for despair. Under White's direction, the back-breaking work of rebuilding began. But this time, the goal was not a fortress, it was a village. They set to work repairing the existing structures and building new ones. The houses they constructed would have been simple, timber-framed dwellings, likely wattle and daub lattice of woven sticks plastered with a mixture of clay, dung, and straw with thatched roofs. They were dark, smoky, and cramped by modern standards, but they were homes. The blacksmith's forge was set up, its bellows breathing life into the settlement with the ringing of hammer on anvil. The cooper began shaping staves for barrels. The women worked tirelessly, unpacking the few household goods they had brought, ranging their cooking pots, and attempting to create order and domesticity in the wilderness. The sound of children's voices, absent from the previous expedition, now echoed along the forest paths. It was this sound, more than anything else, that truly differentiated this colony. It was the sound of a future. Just a few weeks after their arrival, on the 18th of August, a moment of profound symbolic significance occurred. Eleanor Dare, the governor's daughter, went into labor in one of the crude, newly repaired houses surrounded by the other women of the colony. She gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. Her birth was more than a personal joy. It was a statement of intent fulfilled. It was the physical embodiment of the colony's purpose. She was the first true native of this new Virginia, a living bridge between the old world and the new. For a brief, hopeful moment, the struggles of the present must have receded before the powerful symbolism of this new life. She was their future. Daily life in this fledgling community was a constant negotiation with an unfamiliar environment. The men would have cleared fields for planting, breaking the tough, root-bound soil with immense effort. They sowed the wheat and barley seed they had brought, and likely also planted the maize they obtained through trade, learning, however reluctantly, from the agricultural practices of the people they called savages. Hunting and fishing were not pastimes but essential pursuits. Parties of men would venture into the woods with their matchlock guns, a loud and inefficient but deadly tool for hunting deer. Others would fish in the sounds, using nets and lines. The women and children would have foraged for nuts, berries, and edible greens, their eyes slowly learning to distinguish the bounty of the forest from its many dangers. Their relationship with the native peoples was the colony's most delicate and pressing concern. The memory of Lane's conflict with the CROATOAN hung heavy in the air. One of their first acts was to seek out their old allies, the CROATOANs from the island of CROATOAN to the south, through Manteo, who had once again accompanied them from England and who was now, in a remarkable gesture, christened and named Lord of Roanoke by the English. They attempted to re-establish friendly relations, but the landscape of power had shifted. The CROATOAN, still grieving and enraged over the killing of Pemisopen, were openly hostile. Confronted a party of CROATOAN who were apparently gathering food near the colony. A fight broke out, and one of the CROATOAN was shot. It was a disastrous repetition of the old patterns of fear and violence. This incident highlighted the colony's profound vulnerability. They were not self-sufficient yet, and their food supply was precarious. Their only secure source of grain was through trade with the CROATOANs, a lifeline that felt tenuous as the summer began to wane. A consensus grew among the settlers. They needed more supplies, more support, more people from England if they were to survive. They pressured Governor White, their leader and link to the homeland, to return to England to plead their case. It was an agonizing decision for White. It meant leaving his daughter, his newborn granddaughter, and the entire community he was responsible for. But the argument was compelling. Only he could properly convey their specific needs and their dire situation. And so, in late August of 1587, just days after the birth of his granddaughter, John White was persuaded to sail for England. The parting must have been thick with emotion. He was leaving his flesh and blood in a fragile settlement on the edge of a wilderness, surrounded by potential enemies and dependent on a thin thread of trade. As his ship pulled away from the shore, the colonists who stood watching on the beach represented the entirety of English civilization in the New World. They were a community of families, of craftsmen, of women and children. They had built the cradle, and within it lay Virginia Dare, a symbol of hope in a world of gathering shadows. They waved to the receding ship, trusting that their governor would return within a year. They turned back to their work, to their homes, to the task of surviving the winter. They could not know that the man sailing away was the last European they would ever see. The sight of Governor John White's ship, its sails diminishing to a speck, then vanishing into the vast, indifferent expanse of the Atlantic, must have cast a profound silence over the little community in Roanoke Island. It was a silence, filled not with peace, But with the weight of their own isolation, they were now utterly on their own. The 115 men, women, and children, including the infant Virginia Dare, swaddled in her mother's arms, represented a tiny, flickering flame of European life in a continent of immense. Ancient darkness, the initial energy of building their homes, of establishing their routines, now gave way to the grim, day-to-day business of survival in a land that was at best indifferent, and at worst, actively hostile. The first and most immediate crisis was the dwindling of their supplies. The provisions they had unloaded from the Lion were never intended to be a long-term solution. The salted meats and hardtack, even when carefully rationed, began to run low. The English seeds they had sown in their cleared plot wheat, barley, and peas struggled in the unfamiliar, sandy soil and under the fierce Carolina sun, a different beast altogether than the gentle light of an English summer. Their yield was pitiful, a handful of stunted grains where they had hoped for sheaves of plenty. They were, as Ralph Lane's colony had been before them, perilously dependent on the land's natural bounty and the generosity of their neighbors. But the land, while abundant, did not yield its treasures easily to those who did not know its secrets. This reliance on the native populations became the colony's central, agonizing dilemma. Their primary ally was Manteo and his people, the CROATOANs from the island to the south. Through Manteo, they could barter for maize, the life-giving corn that was the staple of the Algonquian diet, a copper kettle, an iron axe head, a string of blue glass beads. These were the currencies with which they purchased their daily bread. But this relationship was a fragile reed. The CROATOANs had their own needs, their own carefully calculated stores to see them through the winter. The constant, draining demand from the English, who had no surplus of their own to offer in a true reciprocal exchange, must have strained the CROATOANs' goodwill. Each bushel of corn given to the strangers was a bushel not stored for their own children. And then there were the CROATOAN. The memory of the violence, the killing of Pemasopan by Lane's men, and the more recent fatal skirmish was a fresh wound. The CROATOAN did not see a community of peaceful families. They saw the same breed of violent, demanding intruders who had plagued them before. Canoes that ventured near the English settlement were watched with suspicion. Foraging parties that strayed too far from the palisade did so at their peril. The forest, which had once seemed to John White a subject for beautiful illustration, now seemed to hold 1,000 hidden eyes. Every rustle of leaves, every snapped twig, could be the precursor to an arrow. The colonists lived in a state of low-grade, constant anxiety, a siege mentality without a visible besieging army. Their world shrank to the clearing round their village, the path to the shore, and the well-trodden route to their struggling fields. Disputes inevitably fled. It is not difficult to imagine the tensions within the palisade. Ananias Dare, as a gentleman and the father of the first English child, may have assumed a leadership role in White's absence. But he was a bricklayer, not a soldier or a seasoned governor. Other gentlemen, their pride stung by hunger and fear, would have questioned his decisions. The farmers and craftsmen, the backbone of the colony, would have grown resentful if they felt the dwindling supplies were not distributed fairly. The women, tasked with making a handful of grain feed a family for a week, would have whispered their fears to one another in the smoky dimness of their huts, their eyes on their own hungry children. The community, designed to be a harmonious replication of English village life, was being tested by the same pressures that had broken the military discipline of Lane's company. It was in this atmosphere of creeping dread and dwindling hope that the colonists made their fateful decision. They could not hold out indefinitely. They had been promised resupply within a year, but a year is an eternity when your stomach is clenched with hunger and the nights are growing colder. They needed more than just food. They needed more people, more farmers, more soldiers for protection, more families to strengthen their numbers against the overwhelming scale of the wilderness. They needed to reinforce their claim, to prove to the CROATOAN and to themselves that they were not a transient nuisance, but a permanent fact, and so they formulated a plan. Before Governor White had even departed, they had discussed the possibility of relocating the Chesapeake Bay, their original destination, still beckoned as a promised land of deeper waters and friendlier tribes. If they were to move, they would need to leave a message for White, lest he return to Roanoke and find them gone. They agreed upon a simple, yet clear, system. If they were to leave in distress, they would carve the name of their destination on a tree or post. As a precaution, they would also carve a Maltese cross above the name, the universal symbol of urgency and danger. A silent scream for help etched into wood. We do not know the exact moment the decision was made to send White back to England. It was likely a collective one. Born of desperation, he was their governor, their most prominent figure, the man whose voice and first-hand account would carry the most weight with Raleigh and the Privy Council. His personal connection, his daughter and granddaughter, made him the most compelling possible advocate for their rescue. To send anyone else would be to send a lesser play, and so they persuaded him to go. One can only imagine the heart-wrenching scene of his parting from Eleanor. He was holding his infant granddaughter, Virginia, for what he believed would be the last time for a few months, but what was, in fact, the last time forever. He was leaving his child in a situation growing more precarious by the day, trusting in God and the resilience of the colonists that he would find them well upon his return. John White's journey back to England in the late summer of 1587 was swift, a matter of weeks. But his arrival home was not the triumphant return of a colonial governor seeking reinforcements. It was the beginning of a new, different kind of agony. He stepped back into a nation that was holding its breath. A nation whose gaze was fixed not on the wilds of Virginia, but on the storm clouds gathering in the English Channel. The long-simmering Cold War with Spain was about to boil over into a fight for a national survival. King Philip II of Spain had finally lost patience with the heretic queen and her pesky privateers. He had given the order, the Spanish Armada, the most powerful naval force ever assembled. A great and most fortunate navy of 130 ships carrying 19,000 soldiers was preparing to sail from Lisbon to invade England. In the face of this existential threat, the plight of 100-odd colonists on the other side of the world vanished into insignificance. White found his patron, Sir Walter Raleigh, consumed with the national defense, preparing ships and men to fight the coming invasion. The Privy Council had issued a proclamation. All shipping was embargoed. No vessel capable of bearing arms was permitted to leave English waters. They were to be pressed into service for the realm's defense. The Lion and the other pinnaces that had carried White were themselves caught up in the mobilization. His desperate pleas for a single ship, for a handful of supplies, fell on deaf ears. What were a few sacks of corn weighed against the fate of a nation? For White, the year 1588 was a purgatory of frantic, futile effort. He was a man trapped by history, watching the calendar pages turn, each one a lash against his soul. He knew what each passing month meant for the colonists. The onset of winter, the starvation, the growing desperation. He managed to secure 2 small pinnaces in the spring, a paltry effort, but something. He loaded them with what supplies he could gather and sent them ahead. They never reached Virginia. They were waylaid by French privateers, their cargo seized, their crews lucky to escape with their lives. It was another door slammed shut. Then, in July, the Armada came. The great crescent of Spanish ships was sighted off the Lizard, and all of England mobilized, every seaworthy vessel, from Raleigh's great warships to the smallest coastal bark, was enlisted to fight. White himself was likely caught up in the chaos, a bystander to the epic confrontation that would decide his country's fate. The subsequent defeat of the Armada by English seamanship, Dutch allies, and the notorious Protestant Wind was a cause for national jubilation. But for John White, the victory was bittersweet. It meant the embargo would soon be lifted, but a precious year had been lost. A year in which a newborn would have taken her first steps. A year in which hope could have turned to dust. It took him to more years of battling bureaucracy, investor apathy, and the sheer logistical difficulty of mounting a transatlantic voyage in the aftermath of a war. Before he finally secured passage, it was not a royal fleet. Not even one of Raleigh's ships. It was a privateering expedition, captained by men whose eyes were fixed on Spanish treasure, not on stranded colonists. They agreed to stop at Roanoke on their way to the Caribbean. It was a compromise, a crumb of hope after years of starvation. When John White finally stood on the deck of that ship in the spring of 1590, watching the familiar, low line of the Outer Banks rise from the sea, he was a man hunted by 3 years of nightmares. He was sailing towards an answer, but he carried with him the terrifying weight of what that answer might be. The long wait was over. The reckoning was at hand. The passage across the Atlantic in the spring of 1590 was, for John White, a journey through a private purgatory. The ship he sailed upon was not his own. It was a privateer, the Hope Well, its timber seasoned with the salt of the Caribbean and its crew animated by the single, sharp desire for Spanish gold. For its captain, Abraham Coke, the stop at Roanoke was a contractual obligation, a minor detour on the road to plunder. For White, it was the culmination of 3 years of agonizing delay, a desperate pilgrimage to the altar of his own deepest fears. Every favorable wind that filled the sails, every league of sea slipped astern, was both a blessing and a torment. It brought him closer to an answer, but the question itself had grown monstrous in the long silence. He must have spent those weeks on deck, his artist's eyes, now aged and strained by worry, scanning the western horizon long before any lookout's cry was possible. He would have rehearsed the reunion in his mind 1,000 times. The joyful shouts from the shore as the ship was recognized. The frantic waving from the small boats that would put out to meet them. The sight of his daughter, Eleanor, standing on the beach, perhaps with a small, shy child clinging to her skirts, a child who would be 3 years old now, a child he had never truly known. He would have pictured the solid, reassuring lines of the village, larger now. With new fields cleared, the smoke of hearth fires a promise of community and warmth. These were the images that had sustained him through the nightmare of the Armada year, through the frustrating battles with indifferent officials and parsimonious investors. The first sight of the American coast should have been a moment of profound relief. But as the familiar, low-lying ribbon of the Outer Banks drew near on August 15th, a different kind of tension began to coil in the air. The pilot, familiar with these waters, would have been seeking the inlet, but the coastline was a shifting, treacherous labyrinth of sand and shoal. A great drought had gripped the land, the men noted, and the water levels were unusually low. As they maneuvered through the inlet, a signal was agreed upon. If the colonists were there, they should light a great fire on the shore as a beacon, and the ship would respond with smoke and the firing of cannon, a thunderous hello to shatter the stillness. They saw no fire. They fired their cannon anyway, the concussive boom rolling out over the placid water and dying away into a silence that felt heavier than the sound itself. No answering signal came from the green, unbroken wall of the forest. The following day, the 16th, They sent a party in a ship's boat through the Sounds towards Roanoke Island. White, his heart surely hammering against his ribs, was among them. The journey across the Sound was a study in mounting dread. The water was calm, the sky was clear, but the world seemed preternaturally still. There was no sign of human life, no canoes fishing the rich waters, number columns of smoke rising from the island or the mainland, no distant sounds of axes or voices. It was a beautiful, empty landscape, and its very beauty was a horror. As the boat ground onto the sandy shore of Roanoke, White leapt out, his boots sinking into the familiar grit. He was home, but home was silent. The path from the landing place to the settlement was overgrown, but still discernible. They followed it, their footsteps loud in the hush. The first sight of the palisade was a physical blow. It was not the thriving village of his hopes, nor was it the ruined fort of his darkest dreams. It was something in between, something far more eerie and unsettling. The fort had been deliberately dismantled, not destroyed. The houses within the enclosure were gone, not burned, not shattered by attack, but carefully taken down. It was as if the entire settlement had been disassembled with a quiet, methodical purpose. The area was clean, picked over, abandoned with an unnerving tidiness. The only structures remaining were a few heavy, chest-like structures made of timber, which had been too burdensome to move. White's men, their curiosity overcoming their unease, broke them open. They were found to be empty, save for a heavy coating of rust, the ghostly residue of iron tools, nails, and objects that had been left to the elements and had, over 3 rainy seasons, simply oxidized into nothingness. It was a vision of slow, patient erasure. There were no bones, no signs of a struggle, no hastily dug graves. The absence of violence was, in its own way, more terrifying than its presence. An attack would have been a tragedy, but a comprehensible one. This was a mystery. It was as if the earth had simply opened and swallowed the 115 souls whole, leaving not a whisper behind. Then, one of the men gave a shout. He was pointing to a large, weathered post, one of the corner timbers of the old palisade. Carved into its surface, in clear, Roman capital letters, was a single word, CROATOAN. John White's breath must have caught in his chest. Here was the message, the agreed-upon sign. In the desperate days before his departure, they had decided that if the colonists were forced to leave Roanoke, they would carve their destination into a tree or post. And if they were in distress, if they were leaving under duress, they would add a Maltese cross above the name. His eyes, the eyes that had recorded every detail of this land with such precision, scanned the wood. There was no cross, no symbol of danger or urgency, just the name CROATOAN. Mantio's people, their allies. The message seemed to say, "We have gone to our friends. We are safe." A wave of immense, dizzying relief must have washed over him. They were not dead. They had simply moved. They had relocated to CROATOAN Island, the modern-day Hatteras Island, some 50 miles to the south. It made perfect sense, with relations with the Secreton broken and supplies low. It was the logical, the only. Sanctuary, the orderly dismantling of the village suggested a planned and unhurried departure. They had taken their possessions with them. They had integrated with their allies. But then, as the initial relief subsided, the questions began to swarm. Why had they left no other signs? If they had been living peacefully with the Croatans for 2 years, why had no one sailed down the coast to leave a more detailed message? Why was there no ongoing signal fire, no watch posted for a returning ship? The silence from CROATOAN was as profound as the silence on Roanoke. White was desperate to find the answers. He urged an immediate departure for CROATOAN Island. But the privateers, men on the clock of profit, were growing restless. A summer squall was brewing to the southwest, the sky darkening with a bruised, purple hue. The wind was picking up, and the captain, Abraham Coke, had his priorities. The season for hunting Spanish treasure was wasting. They had fulfilled their obligation. They had taken White to Roanoke. The colonists were not there. The ship's cables, the great ropes that held the anchor, had been fraying, and in the face of a coming storm, the Sound was a dangerously sure. To stay was to risk the ship and the entire voyage's profit. They argued. White pleaded, pointing to the carving, invoking his daughter, his granddaughter, the promises made. But the logic of the sea and the logic of commerce were against him. The storm broke with sudden, ferocious intensity. The Hopewell was nearly driven onto the very shoals they feared, its cables parting with a sound like gunshots. They were forced to cut their last anchor and run before the gale, out into the open, raging Atlantic. For days, they were at the mercy of the wind and waves, blown far from the coast, fighting for their lives. By the time the storm abated and the ship was made seaworthy again, the season was advanced, the supplies were low, and the cruise will to return to the treacherous Carolina Sounds was gone. They turned their bow towards the Caribbean, towards the siren song of Spanish silver. John White stood on the heaving deck, watching the coastline of America recede for the final time. He was a broken man. He had been within 50 miles of his family, of the answers he had sought for 3 agonizing years. He had held the proof of their survival in his hands, that single, carved word, but had been thwarted by a caprice of weather and the hard calculus of greed. He would never return. The carving on the post was the last official word, the final message from the lost colony. It was an answer that only spawned a deeper, more profound mystery. They had gone to CROATOAN. But what then? The silence that followed was to become one of history's most enduring and haunting echoes. The cradle of Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, was empty, its fate swallowed by the whispering pines and the shifting sands of time. The single word, CROATOAN, carved into that sun-bleached post, was not an ending. It was a door, left slightly ajar, through which 3 centuries of speculation would pour. John White's final, thwarted glimpse of the American shore did not close the book on the Roanoke colonists. It merely ended the first, factual chapter written in ink and official record. The subsequent chapters would be written in the fainter, more elusive scripts of rumor, theory, and folklore. The disappearance of the 115 men, women, and children, including the first English child born in the New World. Virginia Dare became a vacuum, and nature, along with human imagination, abhors a vacuum. Into that silence rushed a multitude of possibilities, each with its own compelling threads of evidence and its own profound gaps in logic. The story of Roanoke was no longer a historical event. It had become an American myth, a riddle wrapped in the enigma of a vanished people, the most persistent and, in many ways, the most plausible theory is that of assimilation. The colonists, facing starvation and the hostility of the CROATOAN after White's departure, simply acted on their own contingency plan. They went to their allies, the CROATOANs, on what is now Hatteras Island. This was not a desperate flight, but a logical, premeditated relocation. The careful dismantling of the fort and houses supports this. They were not fleeing an attack, but moving their valuable timber to build anew. For a time, they may have lived as a distinct community alongside the CROATOANs, trading their dwindling supply of iron tools and goods for food and protection. But as years, turned into decades. The sheer demographic weight of the native culture would have been immense. The English group was small, with a disproportionate number of men. Intermarriage would have been not just likely, but essential for survival. Their European clothes would have worn out. Their metal tools would have been lost or bartered away. Their language would have been gradually subsumed by Algonquian. Within a generation or two, the distinct identity of the English colonists would have dissolved, their physical features and perhaps a handful of their possessions absorbed into the broader genetic and cultural tapestry of the coastal Algonquian people. There is intriguing, if circumstantial, evidence for this in the early 1700s. John Lawson, a British explorer, visited the North Carolina coast and spent time with the Hatteras Indians, the descendants of the CROATOANs. He recorded in his journal that they told him stories of their ancestors, and that several of their ancestors were white people and could talk in a book, a clear reference to literacy. He further noted that many of them had grey eyes, a physical trait uncommon among other native groups. This oral tradition, passed down for over a century, is a powerful clue. Later, in the 1880s, a man named Hamilton Macmillan championed the cause of the Lumbee people of Robeson County, North Carolina, arguing they were descended from the lost colonists. He pointed to their many English surnames: Lockler, Oxendine, Dial, Chavis names that bear a striking resemblance to those on John White's rosterlock, Oxwick, Dial. Chavis, the Lumbee, also had a long history of speaking a unique, archaic form of English and practicing traditions that seemed, to Macmillan, to be vestiges of Elizabethan Christianity. While the Lumbee connection is debated and their origins are complex, the persistence of these stories and anomalies suggests a deep, intermingled history. The colonists may not have vanished. They may have simply ceased to be English, but the New World was a dangerous place, and assimilation was not the only path. Another shadow loomed large in the English imagination, that of Spain. The Spanish, from their bastion in St. Augustine, Florida, were intensely aware of the English intrusion into what they considered their territory. Spanish captains had been ordered to locate and eradicate the Roanoke settlement. Could a Spanish patrol, perhaps guided by a captured or bribed native scout, have finally found the colony? If the colonists had relocated to the mainland, as some theories suggest, they would have been even more vulnerable. A Spanish attack would have been swift, brutal, and thorough. The Spanish modus operandi was not to take prisoners from a heretical settlement, but to eliminate it, leaving no witnesses to tell the tale. This theory provides a clean, violent, and final end. It explains the complete lack of remains or artifacts in a concentrated area. However, it is plagued by a lack of evidence from the Spanish side. The extensive Spanish archives from the period contain no boastful reports of such a successful raid, which would have been a significant military and propaganda victory for the governor of Florida. The silence in the Spanish records is a loud argument against this theory. Though not a definitive disproof, then there are the quieter, more insidious killers, disease and famine. The Lane colony had already teetered on the brink of starvation. The 1587 group, larger and including women and children, would have had even greater nutritional needs. A single failed corn crop, a particularly harsh winter, or the final withdrawal of Croatan support could have doomed them. Starvation is a slow, agonizing erasure. It leaves behind fragile, scattered remains that the Carolina forests and its scavengers would have made short work of within a few seasons. Similarly, disease could have been the culprit. The colonists, living in close quarters, might have fallen victim to an epidemic, perhaps one they brought with them, like influenza or smallpox, to which they had some resistance, but which could have mutated in the new environment. or a New World pathogen to which they had no immunity at all, a mass grave, hastily dug by the last few survivors, could have been so shallow that it was quickly reclaimed by the forest. Its contents dissolved into the acidic soil. This theory is the most mundane, and in its sheer banality, perhaps the most tragic. It suggests they didn't fall to sword or arrow, but simply to the relentless, impersonal pressures of an unfamiliar ecosystem. Later settler reports added layers of tantalizing, if frustratingly vague, clues. When the Jamestown colony was established 20 years later in 1607, its leaders, aware of the Roanoke mystery, actively sought information. Captain John Smith recorded stories from Powhatan, the powerful paramount chief, who claimed to have slaughtered the colonists. He presented English-made iron tools to the Jamestown settlers as proof, but Powhatan was a shrewd politician, and his claim could easily have been a boastful lie designed to intimidate the new rivals. More compelling are the reports from William Strachey, the Secretary of Jamestown, who wrote in 1612 that at least a few of the Roanoke colonists were still alive. He heard that they had been taken in by a friendly chief named Ionoko and were living at a place called Pananiok or Panwick, for a day's journey from Jamestown. They were, he was told, made to beat copper at a forge, a fascinating detail that suggests they were valued for their skills as metalsmiths. Yet, despite these specific leads, the perpetually struggling Jamestown settlers never mounted a successful expedition to find them. The clues were there, flickering on the edge of the known world, but never seized upon. The mystery was further deepened by one of the most poignant and bizarre pieces of evidence to emerge from the Jamestown era. A man named George Percy, another early leader, reported that a group of natives from the region of the Pananiok River had shown them a remarkable sight, the carcass of a male child, slain recently, and alongside it, a young English girl. The girl had been discovered in a native village, and when confronted, she did not speak, but merely cried piteously. The account is haunting, but also deeply problematic. Was this a fabricated story to stir sympathy and justify aggression against the natives? Was it a miscommunication or a misunderstanding, or was it a genuine, heartbreaking glimpse of a lone survivor of the lost colony? A girl who could have been Virginia Dare, her identity and language stripped from her by trauma and time. The story is too specific to be entirely dismissed, yet too unverifiable to be accepted as fact. It remains a ghost at the feast of history. Archaeology, the discipline that should provide cold, hard answers, has so far only deepened the mystery. On Hatteras Island, archaeologists have uncovered a fascinating mix of Elizabethan and Native American artifacts from the correct time period: a gold signet ring, parts of a rapier hilt, a slate writing tablet, and German stoneware jugs. These finds confirm a significant and sustained English presence among the CROATOANs, but they do not conclusively prove it was the lost colony. They could be from trade, or from later, unrecorded visitors. Meanwhile, on the mainland, at a site called Site X near the Albemarle Sound, archaeologists have found fragments of Elizabethan pottery and a handful of other artifacts that suggest a small, secondary English presence. This has led to a new split theory, that the colonists did indeed go to CROATOAN first, but that a smaller group, perhaps seeking a better location or more resources, later moved to this mainland site. But again, the evidence is sparse. There are no post holes for houses, no graves, no concentrated evidence of a settlement. The artifacts are whispers, not a conversation, and so the fate of the Roanoke colonists remains suspended between history and legend. They stand at the threshold of the American story, a permanent question mark. Did they become the first true Americans, shedding their English identity to become part of a new, blended people. Their story living on in the grey ice and old surnames of the Lumbee and other coastal tribes. Or did they meet a crueler fate, succumbing to the sword, starvation, or sickness? Their final moments lost to the relentless decay of the southern wilderness. The word CROATOAN was a clue, but it was also a diversion. It pointed not to an answer, but to a deeper wilderness of possibility. The colonists vanished from the historical record, but they never vanished from the American imagination. They're our first ghost story, a foundational mystery that whispers that this new world was, from the very beginning, a place of profound transformation and impenetrable secrets. The cradle, once occupied by Virginia Dare, remains empty, but the echo of her cry, and the silence that followed, still haunts the land. The physical colony on Roanoke Island may have vanished, its timber walls reclaimed by the soil and its thatch roofs dissolved into the humus, but its story was only beginning its long, strange, and resonant journey through the American psyche. For over a century after John White's final, fruitless search, the fate of the colonists remained a practical, if fading, concern, a ghost that haunted the fledgling English efforts on the continent. The early leaders of Jamestown, men like the pragmatic John Smith and the diligent William Strachey, collected the rumors and native reports not as antiquarians, but with the grim urgency of men who saw in Roanoke a possible premonition of their own fate. The mystery was not yet a romantic legend. It was a chilling cautionary tale written in the recent ink of failure. A stark precedent that whispered of a wilderness that could simply swallow over 100 souls without a trace, but as the English foothold in America solidified, as the struggle of Jamestown gave way to the established order of Williamsburg and the colonies, multiplied and prospered along the Atlantic seaboard, the story of Roanoke began to undergo a profound metamorphosis. It was no longer a recent, unsettling tragedy, but a distant, hazy prologue, a story from the olden times. And in that critical transition from a current event to a foundational myth, the Lost Colony was born, a narrative vessel empty and waiting to be filled with the hopes, fears, and ideologies of succeeding generations. The first great transformation of the Roanoke story occurred in the intellectual and cultural ferment of the early American Republic. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as the new United States, raw and self-conscious, sought to forge a national identity distinct from its British parent, it required its own history, its own ancient mysteries, its own cast of heroic and tragic figures. The Puritans of Plymouth had their foundational narrative of religious freedom, but it was a story of stern piety and communal austerity. The Roanoke story, by contrast, was a blank canvas, a silhouette against which any number of images could be projected. It was eagerly taken up by writers, poets, and orators who infused it with a new, sentimental, and distinctly American pathos. The figure of Virginia Dare, a mere footnote in John White's ledger, was lifted from the dusty passenger lists and transformed into a potent national icon. She was no longer just an anonymous infant who had drawn her first breath in a crude hut. She became the first daughter of the Dominion, a symbol of pure, nascent America. Her unknown fate a national tragedy that predated the nation itself. She was innocence, potential, and promise, all severed from their known conclusion, making her story uniquely malleable and powerfully poignant. This process of romanticization reached its zenith with the work of popular historians and novelists in the antebellum period. In their retellings, the story was systematically drained of its harsh Elizabethan realities, the gnawing hunger, the complex and often brutal mutual suspicion, the desperate calculus of survival in a land that was indifferent to their European notions of hierarchy and property. In its place, they erected a stirring melodrama suited to the sentimental tastes of the age. Virginia Dare, in these narratives, was not allowed to remain a child. She grew, in the public imagination, into a woman of unparalleled beauty and virtue, a forest princess who somehow embodied the best of both her English heritage and her New World home. The native peoples, who in reality were sophisticated political actors navigating the arrival of a dangerous and destabilizing force, were flattened into simplistic, moralistic archetypes, the eternally noble and friendly CROATOAN, epitomized by Mantiu, versus the wicked, scheming, and vengeful savage, often a fictionalized and demonized version of Wingina, Pemisopan, the colony's end was frequently reimagined as a grand, tragic romance, with the adult Virginia Dare at its center, often perishing as a martyr to save her people or as a consequence of a doomed love affair that crossed cultural boundaries. These retellings, published in popular magazines like Goddess Lady S Book and in sentimental histories that prioritized emotion over evidence, were less concerned with historical accuracy than with providing the new nation with a poignant, romantic, and suitably distant founding myth. The colonists hadn't just disappeared due to a failure of logistics and diplomacy. They had been spiritually absorbed into the sublime, terrifying, and beautiful American wilderness, becoming one with the very land that had consumed them. A notion that resonated deeply with the Romantic movement's fascination with nature and the sublime, the 19th century's parallel fascination with the occult, the spiritual, and the pseudo-scientific provided another, darker layer to the evolving myth. As the scientific method began to systematize and categorize the known world, the unknown and the unresolved became all the more alluring. The Lost Colony became a favorite subject for parlor seances, amateur antiquarians, and treasure hunters. The most persistent and bizarre legend to emerge from this fertile ground was that of the Virginia Dare stone. In 1937, at the height of the Great Depression, a California tourist named Lewis Hammond claimed to have found a large, heavy, inscribed stone near the Roanoke River in North Carolina. The inscription, purportedly written by Eleanor Dare herself, told a harrowing and grammatically chaotic tale of the colonists being attacked by natives and dwindling in number, ending with the heartbreaking words, "Virginia Dare Anoni is dead and went hence unto heaven 1591. The stone caused a media sensation, seeming to offer the direct, first-person closure that had been sought for centuries. It was followed by dozens more stones, allegedly discovered by a Georgia stonecutter named Bill Eberhart, who produced an entire epic narrative of the colonists' wanderings across the southeast. For a time, they were hailed by a few enthusiastic professors and a credulous public as a monumental historical discovery. However, upon proper scholarly, linguistic, and geological examination, the stones were revealed to be an elaborate, if clumsy, hoax. The grammar and spelling were a nonsensical pastiche of modern and archaic forms. The letter forms were anachronistic. And the story they told was a perfect reflection of the 19th century romanticized version, not the 16th century reality. The Dare Stone episode is a crucial part of the Roanoke legacy, not for what it revealed about the 1580s, but for what it revealed about the 1930s, a deep, desperate public desire for a neat, dramatic, and discoverable solution to the mystery. A desire so strong it could override skepticism and create its own reality. The 20th century brought a more scientific, though no less passionate, approach to the enigma. The birth of professional archaeology and rigorous historical scholarship began to shift the focus from romantic speculation back towards material evidence and documentary analysis. The 400th anniversary of the birth of Virginia Dare in 1937 sparked a renewed interest that was both scholarly and intensely nationalistic. A search for roots during a time of economic and global uncertainty, the most significant cultural Figure of this era was Paul Breen, a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright. His symphonic drama, The Lost Colony, first performed on Roanoke Island in 1937 as part of Franklin D. Roosevelt's Works Progress administration, remains one of the most enduring and influential interpretations staged in an outdoor theater, mere miles from the original settlement, with the actual sounds of the wind and water as its backdrop. Breen's play was a powerful piece of community theater and national myth-making. It masterfully blended known historical figures with theatrical invention, presenting Manteo and Wanchese as philosophical opposites representing cooperation and resistance, giving Eleanor Dare and Virginia Dare a central, emotional role, and concluding not with a question mark, but with a stirring, symbolic image. The colonists, holding aloft a cross and an English flag, march solemnly into the mist-shrouded forest, consciously choosing faith and a new, unknown destiny over a return to the old world. Breen's interpretation was fundamentally patriotic and uplifting. The colonists were not victims of a failed enterprise, but pioneers of the spirit who consciously chose to become one with America. This powerful, stirring image, repeated summer after summer for decades, has cemented The Lost Colony as a story of American genesis and sacrifice for millions of tourists, effectively baptizing the mystery in the waters of national pride simultaneously. Historians like the indefatigable David Beers Quinn began the monumental and glamorous task of sifting through the European archives with a fine-tooth comb. Quinn's life work, embodied in his vast collections of documents and his meticulous analyses, was to compile and contextualize every shred of evidence related to early English exploration. His work served as a necessary corrective, separating documented fact from accumulated folklore, re-establishing the complex political, economic, and religious context of the venture, and systematically stripping away centuries of sentimental varnish. He reminded the world that Roanoke was, first and foremost, a business venture and a strategic gambit in a global Cold War with Spain, not a pilgrimage for religious freedom. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have seen this scientific approach continue and accelerate with the application of modern technology, ground-penetrating radar, soil chemistry analysis, and satellite imagery have been employed in the search for Sitex, the potential mainland location where at least a segment of the colonists may have relocated. The discovery of Elizabethan artifacts on Hatteras Island, a gold signet ring, a rapier hilt, and German stoneware, and at a site near the Albemarle sound fragments of pottery and a unique hardware cale. Deer Tenterhook has given new life and credibility to the assimilation theory, providing tangible, if frustratingly fragmentary, proof that the colonists' story did not abruptly end on the windswept shores of Roanoke Island in 1587, but continued in some form, for years or even generations afterwards. The legacy of Roanoke is therefore a palimpsest, a historical document written over many times, each layer reflecting the anxieties and aspiration of its own era. It is the cautionary tale recorded in the worried dispatches of the Jamestown settlers, a stark reminder of their own vulnerability. It is the romantic national myth of the 19th century, full of noble savages, pure-hearted maidens, and the sublime power of nature. It is the hoax of the Dare Stones, revealing a public hunger for tangible proof and a neat narrative arc. It is the patriotic pageant of Paul Breen's drama, performed under the stars as a ritual of American identity, and it is the meticulous, ongoing work of archaeologists and historians, slowly and patiently uncovering new clues that complicate rather than simplify the story. The story's enduring power lies in its very incompleteness. It is a historical Rorschach test for those who wish to see a warning about the perils of imperial overreach and cultural arrogance. The story provides ample evidence. For those who wish to see a hopeful parable of assimilation and the birth of a new, blended people, the clues are there in the oral histories and the scattered artifacts. For those who seek a simple, tragic tale of a people lost to the maw of time, the silent forest and the single, cryptic carving are enough. The lost colony endures not because we have solved it, but because we cannot. It is the ghost in the American attic, the whisper from the edge of the map, a permanent reminder that the American story began not with a triumphant founding, but with a profound and echoing silence. The cradle of Virginia Dare is empty, but the countless stories we have built round it, the plays, the poems, the hoaxes, the theories, the research form a monument as enduring as any city. A testament to our endless need to find meaning in the silence. The story of the lost colony did not conclude with John White's sorrowful departure, nor with the romantic embellishments of the 19th century, nor even with the patriotic fervor of Paul Green's drama. Instead, it entered a new, technologically augmented phase in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, one driven not by sentiment or national myth-making, but by the quiet, methodical disciplines of science and scholarship. The mystery of Roanoke, once the province of poets and playwrights, now attracted archaeologists with trowels, historians with digital databases, and geneticists with sequencing machines. The quest shifted from interpreting the silence to listening to it with ever more sensitive instruments, hoping to detect a faint, material whisper from the past. Yet, with each new discovery, the mystery has not so much been solved as it has been deepened. Its dimensions refined and its complexities magnified. The most tangible advances have come from the field of archaeology. For decades, the search was focused intensely on the sandy soils of Roanoke Island itself, the Fort Raleigh National Historic Site, a carefully manicured landscape, became the symbolic heart of the story. Yet, decades of intermittent digging within the reconstructed earthworks yielded frustratingly little, beyond a handful of Elizabethan artifacts. Enough to confirm the location, but not to explain the disappearance. This very lack of evidence, however, became a clue in itself. It supported the narrative that the colonists had not been wiped out in a catastrophic event on the island, but had left in an organized manner. This realization pushed the search outward, into the wider sound and river systems of what is now North Carolina. The most compelling archaeological work in recent years has centered onto locations, forming the basis of a split or multi-site theory. The first is the area around Cape Creek on Hatteras Island, the historical home of the CROATOAN people. Here, a team led by archaeologist Mark Horton has unearthed a compelling assemblage of artifacts that speak of sustained, intimate contact. The findings are not a buried chest of treasures, but the quiet detritus of daily life, mingled inextricably with a native settlement. A small, copper-based aglet of the sort used to lace Elizabethan doublets, a fragment of a writing slate, is stoneware Bartman jug from Germany. Most significantly, the hilt of Arabia, its iron blade long since rusted away, but its delicate handguard a clear artifact of a gentleman's weapon. These are not items likely to have been traded for inland. They suggest the physical presence of Englishmen who lived, worked, and died alongside the CROATOANs. The archaeology here does not scream of a dramatic end, but murmurs of a slow, gradual assimilation of objects losing their original context and becoming part of a new, hybrid culture. The second focal point, known as Citex, is a patch of land on the mainland, near the confluence of the Albemarle and Chowan rivers, proposed by historian James Horn and investigated by the First Colony Foundation. This site was suggested by a re-examination of John White's maps, which showed a faint, corrected patch, a potential secret symbol indicating a planned relocation point. Excavations at Site X have yielded their own tantalizing, if modest, finds, fragments of North Devon plain balustrature, a type of ceramic used for storing provisions on ships, and, most evocatively, a handful of tenterhooks. Small metal hooks used in the Elizabethan cloth-making industry to stretch fabric on frames. These artifacts, while sparse, point to the presence of a small, perhaps temporary, English settlement in the late 16th century. The emerging theory posits that the colonists, upon White's departure, initially moved as a whole to CROATOAN Hatteras, but that a smaller group, perhaps seeking better farmland or a more defensible position closer to native groups friendly to them, later established a satellite settlement here on the mainland. This theory elegantly explains the Hatteras evidence and the Jamestown era rumors of English survivors living with an inland chief named Roanoke. Parallel to the work of the Trowell is the revolutionary potential of genetics. The most tantalizing modern hypothesis is that the lost colonists did not die out, but were absorbed into the native population, their European DNA diffusing into the gene pool of southeastern tribes, the Lumbee people of Robeson County, North Carolina, with their long-held oral traditions of Hatteras ancestry and their plethora of surnames, matching the Roanoke roster, have been a central focus of this inquiry, a definitive DNA study. However, is a labyrinthine challenge. It requires finding verifiable, direct descendants of the 1587 colonists in England to establish a genetic baseline, a task complicated by centuries of migration, common names, and incomplete records. Then, it requires the consent and participation of native communities, for whom DNA is not merely a historical tool but a sacred link to ancestry and identity, and whose trust has been often betrayed by earlier generations of researchers. The science promises a clear answer, but it is enmeshed in a thicket of ethical, cultural, and practical complications, ensuring that if the genetic ghost of Eleanor Dare or Ananias Dare walks in the veins of people today, its confirmation will be neither quick nor simple. Despite or perhaps because of these ongoing investigations, Roanoke has lost none of its cultural power. It has seamlessly transitioned from a historical puzzle into a versatile fixture of American popular culture, a byword for mysterious disappearance. It serves as the foundational horror story for a nation, its premise fueling countless fictional works. In literature, it provides the backstory for our supernatural thrillers, where the colonists fall victim to ancient curses or mythical creatures, as in novels like The Kingdom of Shadows or the Lost Colony series on television. Its framework is borrowed for science fiction, most famously in the X-Files episode Colony, Endgame, where the disappearances are linked to alien replicants, and more recently in the series American Horror Story, Roanoke, which recast the entire saga as a grisly, recurring ghost story rooted in land drenched in blood. These interpretations are less concerned with historical fact than with tapping into the story's core potency, the fear of being utterly and inexplicably erased, of a community vanishing into the dark woods of an unknown continent, leaving behind only a cryptic, unanswered plea. What, then, does Roanoke mean for us today, in the 21st century? It is no longer merely a cold case from the age of Elizabeth. It has become something richer and more profound, a permanent meditation on the human condition. It is, first, a timeless lesson in the fragility of ambition. Sir Walter Raleigh's dream was a grand one, a vision of a new English world that would bring him glory, his queen wealth, and his god new souls. It was funded by vast sums, equipped with the best technology of the day, and staffed with a cross-section of English society, and yet it founded not on the grand stage of international conflict with Spain, but on the mundane, brutal realities of a new ecosystem, unfamiliar crops, fragile supply lines, and the complex, unforgiving politics of human relationships across a cultural chasm. Roanoke stands as a humbling monument to the fact that the most meticulously laid plans of powerful men can be undone by a single drought, a misunderstood gesture, or a failed harvest. Secondly, it is a poignant narrative of failure, but a failure that is peculiarly American. Unlike the catastrophic failures of other early colonies, Roanoke's end was not a definitive, recorded massacre or a mass exhumation of graves. Its failure was an ambiguity. This ambiguity has allowed it to be reimagined not just as an ending, but as a strange kind of beginning. In the American imagination, the colonists did not just die, they transformed. They became the first to go native, to shed their old identities and become part of the new land. This interpretation transforms a historical defeat into a mythic victory of adaptation, a theme that resonates deeply with a nation built on immigration and the idea of self-invention. Their failure to remain English became, in legend, their success at becoming the first Proto-Americans. And finally, Roanoke endures because of the enduring power of the unanswered question. In an age of information saturation, where answers to most factual queries are a few keystrokes away, the profound, echoing silence from that Carolina shore holds a strange comfort. It is a reminder that the past does not yield all its secrets easily, that some stories remain stubbornly open-ended. The single word CROATOAN is not an answer. It is the last line of a first chapter, and the rest of the book is missing. This incompleteness invites us in. It allows the historian, the scientist, the novelist, and the tourist to all participate in the story, to bring their own questions and their own imaginations to bear on the mystery. The settlers of the city of Raleigh, and little Virginia Dare in her cradle, have been gone for centuries. The sound of their axes and their prayers has long been replaced by the wind in the longleaf pines and the gentle lap of water on the shore of Roanoke Island. They sought to impose a permanent order on the landscape, to build a fortress and a home that would last for ages. In that, by the strictest measure, they failed. But in their vanishing, they achieved a different, unintended kind of permanence. They became a story, and a story, especially one without an ending, is perhaps the most enduring thing of all. It is a vessel that never fills, a question that never tires of being asked, a quiet, persistent echo from the edge of the known world, reminding us of the ambition, the fragility, and the profound mystery that lies at the very heart of the American experiment. And that, dear friends, is the Lost Colony of Roanoke, a story with more questions than answers, and perhaps that's why it lingers. If you've got your own theory about what really happened, leave it in the comments. I'll be reading through them. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next long, probably to detail, but always boringly accurate walk through history. Thanks for watching.